Scope News. I'm Tiffany Nielsen, and joining me as always is my incredible co-host, Johannes Beekman. How are you today, Johannes?
I'm doing great, Tiffany. How's your day going?
Excellent. Thanks for asking. And Johannes, every month we try to find the story behind the headlines. But this month, it was a little harder to summarize because nothing really pointed in the same direction, on the surface anyway. New AI models, government restrictions, custom chips, data center theft, bots overtaking human traffic online, even global ethical institutions weighing in. And at first glance, it doesn't look connected.
And yet it is, not because the technology changed in one direction, but because everything around it started responding at the same time.
So this month, the question isn't what AI did, it's how everything around it is reorganizing.
Tiffany, history has an interesting rhythm. So first comes the invention, then comes the excitement, eventually reality arrives. That's when society begins reorganizing itself around the technology that has become too important to ignore. And I think we're beginning to witness that moment with artificial intelligence.
I think you're absolutely right, Johannes. Today, we're covering frontier AI models, government intervention, custom silicon, infrastructure pressure, rising compute costs, bot dominated internet traffic, large scale buildouts, policy debates over ownership, quantum security implications, and a growing global conversation about what AI should mean for human decision making.
Apparently, we have reached the point where semiconductor engineers, members of Congress, cybersecurity experts, and the Pope all have something to say about artificial intelligence. That is usually a sign a technology has become much bigger than the technology itself.
Well, let's dive in. To begin with, OpenAI, because this month the company unveiled its latest family of frontier models, GPT 5.6, along with specialized models named Sol, Terra, and Luna. But unlike previous launches that made headlines overnight, this rollout has been intentionally limited. Access is currently restricted to a relatively small group of preview partners, many of them working with government agencies or large enterprise organizations. Johannes, this didn't feel like the splashy product launch we've come to expect. It almost felt quiet.
I think quiet was the point, Tiffany. This indeed doesn't feel like a normal product launch. It feels more like a controlled field deployment. So a few years ago, up until the beginning of this year, the strategy was clearly get the model in front of as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And that made sense when the main story was adoption. But frontier AI is entering a different phase right now. These systems are being used inside companies, inside workflows, and in some cases inside government adjacent environments. So the question is no longer just can people try it? It is what happens when people actually depend on it. And that, of course, changes the rollout strategy.
So instead of saying, here's the newest AI, everyone have fun, they're saying, let's make sure this behaves the way we expect it to before opening the floodgates.
Exactly. And I think, is what the real story is here. This is not just about making the model more exclusive, it's about learning how it performs under serious use. How does it behave with enterprise data? How does it handle sensitive prompts? How reliable is it across long tasks? Where does it fail? And who's responsible when it does? Those are not questions you answer with a flashy public launch. You answer them with a smaller group of users, tighter monitoring, and a much clearer understanding of the risk before you scale it.
Well, one thing that stood out to me was the introduction of multiple specialized models instead of one flagship system. Why split them up?
Well, because the market is starting to ask for different kinds of intelligence. And that may sound strange, but it does matter. A research lab may want a model that is very strong at scientific reasoning. A software company may care more about coding and debugging. A media team may need multimodal analysis. A large enterprise may care about workflow automation, security controls, and integration with internal systems. Those are different jobs. So Instead of one model trying to be the answer to everything, we're starting to see more purpose built systems, and that's probably where this market was always going.
Which means choosing an AI model is moving from feeling like downloading an app to more like hiring the right expert for the job.
Yes, it is. And that's a much healthier way to look at it. So the old question was, which model is the smartest one? But that question is becoming too simplistic. A better question is smartest at what? Smartest at writing code, smartest at reasoning through a technical problem, smartest at handling documents, smartest at working safely inside a company systems. This is where buyers are going to have to become much more disciplined because the best model in the benchmark is not automatically the best model for your business process.
Of course, one question a lot of people probably had when they heard this announcement was, can I use it?
Not yet, Tiffany.
So it's like trying to get reservations at the newest restaurant in Manhattan. Everyone's talking about it, but very few people are actually inside.
And that's about right. And for most users, myself included, that is frustrating. But from OpenAI side, it may be the safer move. When a model becomes powerful enough to matter in enterprise, government, research, or security sensitive settings, access itself becomes part of the product strategy. Who gets it first? What are they allowed to do with it? What feedback comes back? What problems show up before the general public even sees it? So, yes, the tables will probably expand, but I think the bigger message is that frontier AI is moving from consumer excitement into controlled deployment. And you're right, that's a very different phase of the industry.
And as it turns out, sometimes that decision isn't entirely up to the companies themselves. And our next story may have been one of the most surprising developments of the month. Anthropic temporarily disabled access to two of its new frontier models, Claude Fable 5 and Mythos 5, following new U.S. export control requirements. For a brief period, customers around the world suddenly found themselves unable to access some of the company's most advanced AI capabilities. And a few days later, reports emerged that service would soon be restored after regulators clarified the implementation of those controls. So, Johannes, that all happened remarkably fast. So, what exactly is going on?
Well, Tiffany, it moved fast because this was not really an outage story. It was an access control story. To customers, it may have looked like a product suddenly went offline, but behind the scenes, Anthropic was reacting to a policy change. And with frontier AI, companies do not have much room to wait and see. So when expert control rules change, the safe move is often to pause access first, sort out the details second, and then reopen once regulators clarify what is actually required. And that's what made this feel so abrupt. The technology did not break, the rules around the technology shifted.
Which means this wasn't a technical failure, it was compliance.
Exactly. And compliance at this level is not just paperwork. It can determine who gets access to a model, where that model can be used, what kind of customer can use it, and how quickly a company has to respond when the rules change. That's a very different world from normal software. So for years, we treated AI models like cloud services. A company released a better version, customers upgraded, and the market moved on. But frontier AI is now entering the same category as other strategic technologies, not because it's identical to semiconductor or aerospace, but because governments are starting to ask the same basic question: where can this capability go, and who should be allowed to use it?
And I think that's what surprised people. Most of us don't expect an AI model to disappear because of export regulations.
And that is the part that feels new to most users. People experience AI as a chat window or an API. It feels weightless, it feels like software. But the regulators are not just looking at the interface, they're looking at capability. Can the model accelerate cyber operations? Can it support advanced technical research? Can it be integrated into military or intelligence workflows? Can it give an organization a strategic advantage? Once those are the questions that are being asked, the model is no longer just a product, it becomes part of a much larger geopolitical conversation. And that's why this story matters.
So this is bigger than Anthropic because this story highlights the changing relationship between governments, and frontier AI?
Absolutely. Of course, Anthropic was the company in the headline of this story, but this is an industry wide issue. The bigger issue is whether frontier AI can still be treated like a globally available digital service. Because if the most advanced models can cross borders instantly through an API, governments are going to want to have some say in that process. And that creates a new kind of tension. AI companies want scale, customers want reliability, governments want control. And these three priorities will not always line up neatly. So the competition is no longer just about who builds the best model, it's also about who gets permission to deploy it, where it can be deployed, and under what conditions.
And that raises another interesting point. Businesses are increasingly relying on AI in their day to day operations. And if access can change because of policy decisions, that's something executives now have to think about.
And very much so, Tiffany. And this is where the story becomes really practical. If a company is using AI for experiments, a temporary disruption is annoying. But if AI is embedded into customer service, software development, analytics, compliance review, sales operations, or product workflows, then model access becomes part of business continuity. And that means that executives need to start asking much harder questions. What happens if a model becomes unavailable? Do we have a fallback? Are we dependent on one provider? Are there regional restrictions? Are we using a model in a way that could be affected by future regulation? And all that may sound premature, but this month showed that it's not. AI availability is becoming a real operational risk.
It's fascinating. Just a couple years ago, we were asking whether AI would change business, and now businesses are asking how government decisions could change AI.
And yes, Tiffany, that's why this month's headlines feel different. The model didn't suddenly become smarter overnight. The customer need didn't suddenly change overnight. What's changed was the surrounding system. AI is being pulled into export policy, national security, infrastructure planning, procurement strategy, and business continuity. And that's a sign that the industry has crossed a threshold. When the technology is still emerging, the main question is adoption. When it becomes strategically important, the main question becomes control. And that's exactly where frontier AI appears to be heading.
And if governments are beginning to recognize AI as a strategic asset, the next question becomes who controls the hardware that powers it? Well, one of the most closely watched developments this month came out of a surprising partnership between OpenAI and Broadcom, revealing a custom built AI inference processor codenamed Jalapeño. Now, Johannes, I think a lot of people hear AI chip and assume it's just another faster processor. But the way that this one is being described, it feels different. What's going on here?
What's going on here is that AI is moving from a model race to a systems race. For the past few years, the headline question was who has the most capable model? But once you start serving AI to millions or eventually billions of users, the question changes. It becomes how efficiently can you run that intelligence every second of every day? And that's where inference matters. Training is how you build a model. Inference is every time the model is actually used. Every prompt, every search result, every agent interaction, every enterprise workflow. So a customer inference chip is not just about making AI faster, it's about making AI economically sustainable at scale.
So, this is about cost and speed, not just capability.
Exactly. And I would add reliability and control. At small scale, you can absorb inefficiency. At OpenAI's scale, inefficiency becomes an operating model. If each interaction costs too much, or takes too much power, or depends too heavily on scarce hardware, the entire business becomes harder to scale. And I just mentioned OpenAI, but of course I should have said Google, Meta, Claude, everybody is in the same boat. But this is why inference is such a big deal. The public sees the answer appear on the screen, the company sees the cost of producing that answer across chips, memory, power, cooling, networking, and data centers. So even a small improvement per query can become a major advantage when you multiply it across global usage.
And that explains the custom chip. But why build it with Broadcom instead of just optimizing existing hardware?
Because once the workload becomes large and predictable enough, specialization starts to pay off. A purpose GPU is incredibly flexible. That's why it became so important to AI. But flexibility is not always the same thing as efficiency. If you know the kind of workload you're going to run, large scale inference repeated constantly under tight cost and latency constraints, you can begin designing hardware around that workload. And that's where a company like Broadcom becomes interesting. This is not just about making a chip, it's about packaging together silicon design, networking, data movement, and high volume infrastructure. In AI, the chip is only part of the story. Moving the data efficiently can matter almost as much as doing the computation.
So instead of adapting the software to the hardware, they're shaping the hardware around the software.
Exactly, Tiffany. And that's the real shift. Software and hardware are starting to co design each other. The model architecture influences the chip influences the data center influences the economics, and the economics influence what kind of AI products can actually be offered. That's why this is bigger than one processor. When a company invests in custom silicon, it's making a long term bet on the shape of its own AI workload. It's saying, we know where our demand is going, and we want infrastructure built specifically for that future. That's a very different level of commitment.
Well, there's also a strategic angle here, right? Because if you control the chip, you reduce dependence on external suppliers.
Yes, control is the key word here. It doesn't mean that OpenAI suddenly controls the entire hardware supply chain, but it does mean that the company is trying to reduce strategic dependence where it can. And that matters because compute has become one of the great bottlenecks in AI. If your growth depends entirely on access to someone else's chips, someone else's manufacturing capacity, someone else's allocation decisions, and someone else's pricing, then your roadmap is not fully your own. And custom silicon gives you leverage. It gives you more say over performance, cost, supply planning, and product strategy. In a market this competitive, that can be the difference between having a model people admire and having a platform people can actually use at scale.
Which makes me think about how quickly this is evolving. Because it wasn't that long ago that the conversation was about who had the best model. But now it's about who can actually afford to run it.
And that is exactly the shift that we're seeing, Tiffany. Model intelligence still matters, but intelligence that's too expensive to serve becomes strategically limited. That's especially true as AI moves from occasional prompts to always on systems, agents, co pilots, customer service automation, code generation, research tools, and enterprise workflows. Those systems do not just answer once, they reason, check, call tools, retrieve data, revise, and try again. That means more inference, not less. So the next phase of AI will not be won only by the company with the most impressive demo. It will also be shaped by the company that can deliver useful intelligence at the lowest sustainable cost. And that is where chips become strategy.
So the chip isn't just a technical upgrade, it's a business decision baked into the silicon.
Yes, it is. And what makes silicon decisions so important is that they are not easy to undo. Software can change quickly, pricing can change quickly, product packaging can change quickly. But once you design custom hardware, you are making assumptions about demand, architecture costs, power, supply chains, and the future direction of your platform. And that's why this story matters. The Jalapeño chip is not just another AI component, it's a signal that the frontier AI companies are no longer just building models, they are building the industrial base required to run them.
And our next story sounds almost like a plot twist in a tech thriller. In the United States, law enforcement reported a series of cargo thefts targeting shipments of AI related data center equipment. And in one case alone, more than $1 million worth of hardware was recovered, including copper wiring and server components. Johannes, I don't think I've ever heard of people specifically targeting AI infrastructure shipments before.
Well, that's what makes this story interesting, Tiffany. It's not that theft is new, it's what's being stolen.
So, what's changed?
Value density, to put it in two words. A few years ago, stealing cargo might have meant electronics, tools, or consumer goods. Now you have shipments containing highly specialized components tied directly to AI data centers, hardware that's expensive, in demand, and sometimes, very often, difficult to source quickly.
So these aren't random thefts. They're targeting bottlenecks in the AI supply chain.
That's a very good way to think about it. And it says something about how quickly AI infrastructure has become economically significant. So when criminals start specializing, it usually means the underlying industry has crossed a threshold.
That's a slightly unsettling benchmark.
It is indeed, but it also mirrors what we've seen historically. During major industrial expansions, high value infrastructure tends to attract attention. Real components, telecom equipment, early computing hardware. So it's not unusual. It's just a signal that the system is scaling into something much, much larger.
Well, what stands out to me is how physical this all is. We talk about AI like it lives in the cloud, but here we are talking about trucks, warehouses, and copper wire.
Exactly. And that disconnect between perception and reality is shrinking. The more AI expands, the more it depends on physical systems that can be seen, moved, and unfortunately stolen.
So the cloud has a very physical backbone.
Always has. We are just noticing it more than before.
One of the most important and probably least understood stories this month is what some companies are calling the AI cost crisis. Internal reports from several major tech firms suggest that as AI systems become more agentic, they're consuming dramatically more compute than expected. In some cases, workloads are using up to 1,000 times more tokens than earlier conversational models. And that's led to internal pressure to rethink how these systems are deployed. Johannes, I think a lot of people assumed AI costs would go down over time. I did. But this sounds like the opposite.
It is, at least in some contexts. The assumption was indeed that with more efficient models, we would automatically see a cheaper deployment. But what's happened instead is that the use cases expanded faster than the efficiency improved.
Meaning people are doing more with it than originally planned.
Exactly. And when AI was mostly conversational, usage was relatively predictable. But once you introduce agents, systems that plan, retry, verify, coordinate, and execute multiple step tasks, you dramatically increase the number of operations required per outcome.
So one request doesn't equal one response anymore, it becomes a chain of actions.
Right. And each step consumes compute. So instead of answer a question, you get search, analyze, cross check, refine, execute, validate, and report. That's not a conversation, that is a workflow.
Which sounds more useful, but it also sounds more expensive.
And that's the tension that we're seeing. And companies are now discovering that the scale introduces friction in a way that wasn't obvious at the start. At small scale, these systems feel efficient. At large scale, they behave more like industrial processes.
So this is where the economics start to matter as much as the technology itself.
More than, because once costs become variable and unpredictable, organizations start rethinking where and how they deploy AI, not because it isn't useful, but because efficiency becomes a constraint again.
It feels ironic. We spent years trying to make computers do more for us, and now we're trying to figure out how to make them do it without spending a fortune.
That is often how technological transitions mature, Tiffany. The capability arrives first, the economics follow later, and they don't always arrive neatly aligned.
So, what happens next, Johannes? Do companies scale back?
Some will optimize, some will restrict usage, some will redesign workflows entirely around cost aware AI. But the biggest shift is conceptual. We're moving from thinking about AI as a feature to thinking about it as an operating expense. And those are very different categories.
This next story might be one of the most surreal of the month. According to Cloudflare, automated traffic bots and agents now make up more activity on the internet than human users. That includes everything from scraping and indexing to autonomous agents performing tasks online. Johannes, I think most people still imagine the internet as something that only humans use. But this sounds like that's no longer entirely true.
Well, first off, I wrote a white paper called The Economy of Things years ago. So we saw this coming. But coming back to the bots, yeah, it's not entirely true. And that's the key shift. The internet used to be designed primarily for human interaction, pages, clicks, navigation, browsing, but increasingly, a large portion of traffic isn't human at all. It's not, oh, you have 30% bots, it's much more. So it's systems talking to systems right now.
So, what is the internet actually for now?
It's both for humans and for machines, but not in the same way. Humans experience interfaces, machines experience data flows, and those two layers are starting to diverge.
And that raises a very practical question. If bots are doing more of the browsing, what happens to websites designed for people?
They start serving two audiences simultaneously. One is visual and interactive, the other one is structured and machine readable. And that creates tension in design, SEO, and even business strategy.
So, we're basically building two internets on top of each other?
In a sense, yes. One is for consumption, and the other one is for coordination. And they overlap more than most people realize.
Well, that feels like a major shift that most users probably haven't even noticed yet.
And that's usually how these transitions begin, quietly, until suddenly they are everywhere.
One of the most striking infrastructure stories this month comes from Meta, where the company is reportedly deploying temporary, rapidly assembled data center structures across multiple locations in the United States. These aren't traditional facilities. They're being described as modular, tent like structures designed to house AI servers and expand compute capacity quickly, sometimes within months rather than years. So, Johannes, I have to admit, when I first saw this, I thought it was satire.
And I don't blame you, Tiffany, but it does sound that way at first. But it's actually a real response to a very real constraint:
Which is?
time. The demand for compute is growing faster than traditional infrastructure cycles can accommodate. So, building a conventional data center can take years: planning, permitting, construction, and power integration. But AI demand doesn't wait for that timeline.
So instead of slowing down demand, they're speeding up construction?
Exactly, and that leads to unconventional solutions, modular systems, temporary structures, alternative power configurations, and even experimental cooling approaches.
There was also mention of some of these sites using industrial scale power sources, even jet engine based generation in certain setups. And that sounds extreme.
It is extreme, but it reflects the scale of the demand. When compute becomes a constraint, energy becomes a limiting factor. And when energy becomes a limiting factor, companies start exploring options that would normally sit far, far outside standard infrastructure planning.
It really does feel like the physical world is struggling to keep up.
And that's a fair way to put it. And we've seen this before in other transitions: rail, electricity, telecommunications. When demand accelerates faster than infrastructure can be built, temporary solutions often become permanent longer than expected.
So, what starts out as a workaround becomes the system?
Often, yeah.
Our next story takes us to Washington, where lawmakers are actively debating proposals around AI ownership and economic distribution. One proposal gaining attention would see partial public ownership stakes in major AI companies, along with mechanisms for distributing AI driven economic gains more broadly to the public. Johannes, this feels like a very different kind of conversation than we were having even a year ago.
It is a very different conversation that we were having a year ago. So, for most of the history of technology, The primary question was innovation. What can be built and how fast? Now the question is shifting toward distribution. Who benefits from the systems being built?
And why is that conversation happening now?
Because the scale of impact is becoming hard to ignore. When a technology begins affecting productivity, labor markets, and global competitive standing all at once, it naturally becomes a policy issue.
So, this really isn't about AI as a product, it's about AI as an economic force.
Exactly. And historically, when technologies reach that level of influence, governments tend to step in, not necessarily to slow them down, but to shape how the benefits are being distributed.
So, there's also a broader tension here because companies are investing billions into building these systems while policymakers are asking how that value should be shared.
The tension is going to define the next phase of this industry, Tiffany, not just how advanced AI becomes, but how its economic impact is structured.
So, the debate isn't whether AI creates value, it's who captures it.
And that question rarely stays theoretical for a long time.
Next, quantum computing continues to move from theory into practical concern, particularly in the context of cybersecurity and cryptography. Recent developments around advanced quantum processors have renewed discussion about the long term security of current encryption systems, including those used in financial systems and digital infrastructure. Johannes, this feels like one of those stories that sits slightly in the background until suddenly it doesn't.
And that's the right way to frame it, Tiffany. Quantum computing has been 5 to 10 years away for a very long time. So a lot of people have learned to tune it out. But cybersecurity planning does not work that way. You do not wait until a quantum computer can break today's encryption and then start thinking about migration. By then, of course, it's already too late. The systems we rely on, banking, identity, government records, industrial networks, cloud platforms, were not built to be swapped out overnight. So the real story is not that quantum suddenly arrived. The real story is that serious institutions are starting to plan as if quantum risk now belongs inside the security roadmap.
So even if it's not here yet, systems are already being evaluated as if it could be.
Exactly. And that's because cryptography has a very long tail. Some data only needs to stay private for a few days. Other data needs to stay private for years or even decades. Medical records, financial records, government communications, intellectual property, infrastructure designs, those are long lived assets. That creates what cybersecurity people call the harvest now, decrypt later problem. An adversary may not be able to decrypt the data today, but they can capture it today, store it, and wait for better tools. So the question becomes, how long does this information need to remain secure? And will the encryption protecting it still be strong over that time horizon? And that's why this is becoming a planning issue now.
That's a very different mindset.
It is, and I think this is where the conversation is maturing. So for years, and we've been talking about quantum for years uh, already, but for years, quantum security sounded like a research topic. Interesting, important, but not necessarily urgent for the average organization. Now it's becoming an operational topic. Organizations need to know where they use vulnerable cryptography, which applications depend on it, which vendors, which certificates, which embedded systems, which devices in the field may be hard to update. And that last point matters a lot. A website certificate can be replaced. A device sitting in a factory, utility network, a vehicle, or a remote infrastructure system may be much harder to upgrade or replace. So the hard part is not just inventing post quantum algorithms, the hard part is migrating real systems without breaking them.
And there was also ongoing discussion about quantum implications for cryptocurrencies. Not necessarily immediate disruption, but long term vulnerability depending on implementation.
Yes, and this is where nuance really matters. Quantum risk does not affect every part of crypto in the same way. And it does not mean cryptocurrency suddenly fails tomorrow. The concern is mainly around the cryptographic signatures and public key systems that prove ownership and authorize transactions. If those assumptions weaken, then certain wallets addresses, or transaction models may need to evolve. But timing matters. A practical quantum attack against widely used cryptographic system would require a level of quantum capability that we do not have today. So this is not a panic story. This is a government's an upgrade story. Crypto networks, financial institutions, and digital infrastructure providers all face the same basic question. Can they migrate their security foundations before the old ones become vulnerable? And that is the real issue.
So this is less about disruption happening suddenly and more about a long runway of adaptation.
Exactly, and the runway matters because cryptographic migration is a slow, messy, and deeply interconnected issue. So you have standards, vendors, protocols, software libraries, hardware security modules, browsers, payment systems, cloud services, identity systems, and embedded systems. All of those pieces have to move in some kind of coordinated way. That's why the smartest organizations will not wait for a dramatic breakthrough. They will start with inventory. Where are we using cryptography? What protects our most sensitive data? How long does that data need to remain secure? Which systems can we update easily? And which ones are going to be painful? That may sound boring compared with a quantum breakthrough, but in cybersecurity, boring preparation is usually what prevents dramatic failure.
One of the ongoing threads that we've been tracking over the past couple of months is the Vatican's engagement with artificial intelligence. We first saw them enter the conversation in June, framing AI around questions of human dignity and moral responsibility. But this month, that conversation continued, but in a more developed form, with additional detail around how those principles should apply in practice as AI systems become more embedded in daily life. Johannes, this feels less like a new statement and more like just a follow up phase.
And that's exactly what it is, Tiffany. What we're seeing now is not entry into the conversation, but refinement of the conversation. The initial statements were broad, almost foundational. They established a moral frame about human dignity, accountability, and the importance of preserving human agency as AI systems become more capable. This next stage is more applied. It starts asking, what does it actually mean in systems where AI is making recommendations, supporting decisions, or operating autonomously within institutions?
So, moving from principle to implementation.
Yes, and that shift is important because many of the hardest questions in technology aren't about agreement at the principle level. They are about execution. Most stakeholders can agree that human dignity matters. The complexity begins when you try to define what that means in a hospital system using AI triage, or a legal system using AI assisted review, or even corporate environments where decisions are increasingly shaped by automated systems.
It becomes very practical very quickly.
It does. And that's notably here is that the type of discussion is no longer confined to engineers or policymakers. It's expanding into institutions that traditionally focus on ethics, philosophy, and long term societal structure.
And we've seen versions of this in government, business, and in academia. But now it feels like all of them are converging on similar questions from different directions.
And that convergence is what makes this significant. Different institutions arrive from different starting points, but increasingly they're encountering the same set of underlying issues: how decisions are delegated, where accountability sits, what level of autonomy is acceptable, and how human oversight evolves as systems become more capable.
So, this isn't just about one institution reacting to AI, it's about multiple institutions independently reaching similar conclusions about what needs to be addressed next.
Yes, and historically, when that happens across unrelated systems, it usually signals that the technology has moved from experimental to structural inferential, not because it's new, but because its effects are now being managed rather than discussed.
And so, the interesting shift here is that the conversation isn't expanding outward anymore, it's deepening.
And that's exactly right, Tiffany. We are no longer asking whether AI matters, we're asking how deeply it should be integrated into the systems that define human decision making.
So, Johannes, stepping back from all of this, because it feels like a lot when you put it together. We've got new AI models, government intervention, custom chips, infrastructure being built at unusual speed, bots outnumbering humans online, debates about ownership, quantum concerns, and global ethical discussions. How do you even begin to make sense of a month like this?
I think you look for what repeats. So, what repeats this month isn't a single technology breakthrough, it's response. Every system is adjusting, some are scaling up, some are restricting access, some are redesigning infrastructure, some are rewriting policy, some are reconsidering economics entirely.
So the story isn't what AI did, it's what everything else is doing because of AI.
Exactly. For a long time, we treated artificial intelligence as a subject of change, but increasingly it's becoming the catalyst for change in other systems: energy grids, supply chains, regulatory frameworks, financial models, and even cultural and ethical institutions.
Which means the real shift this month isn't about intelligence at all, it's about adaptation.
Yes, it is. And adaptation rarely happens evenly. Some parts of the system move quickly, others lag behind. And that imbalance is where the most important developments usually appear.
So if April and May were about AI becoming more capable, June about AI becoming embedded, then July feels like the moment that everything around it started reorganizing.
And that is a good way to put it, Tiffany, because the technology isn't arriving anymore. It's already here. Now everything else is adjusting to its presence.
And that adjustment is where the real story is.
It is. And just one more final thought, Tiffany. So as all this unfolds, there is another quieter shift happening in parallel. And that's the way how people discover information is changing. Increasingly, decisions are being shaped not just by search engines, but by AI systems summarizing, interpreting, and recommending, which raises a practical question for every organization. When these systems describe your industry, do they describe you accurately? Or do they miss you entirely?
So visibility isn't just about being found anymore, it's about being understood.
It is about being understood, and that's becoming its own strategic layer.
Well, that may be a conversation for another time, but definitely one worth having.
Absolutely, we need to have that discussion, and we will have that discussion because it's unavoidable. But thanks everybody for joining TechScope News.
Before we go, we want to remind you about our upcoming events, the Intelligent Thinking AI Summit on July 23rd, and the Summit of Things taking place this October. And for anyone watching looking to stay ahead with the latest developments, challenges, and breakthroughs around AI and other emerging technologies, we encourage you to attend. And for those of you looking to share a meaningful message or promote your products and services to our engaged audience, contact us to learn more about how you can get involved and even participate in our upcoming events. And you can register and inquire about being featured in these events all at iotmktg.com. And until next time, thank you for watching, and thank you to you, Johannes, for this invaluable discussion.